Good morning. My name is Amber Hartman Scholz. I'm here in Braunschweig, Germany at the Leibniz Institute DSMZ. We're super excited to have all of you here today, and this will be recorded. Scarlett, give me a thumbs up if this is happening already. Is the recording happening? All right, so you can come back and see this if you missed the beginning part. I'll make an announcement at the very end too. So welcome. We have a little kind of an interesting event today, Nagoya Protocol for Newbies. Newbies, of course, is a slang term for beginners, and what we really wanted to do was to kind of start at the beginning. So what you're going to hear today are, first for me, just a little bit of setting the context. Where is this Nagoya Protocol oriented and all of the other environmental stuff that's out there? Liz is going to go into the details about actually what does this mean for you in compliance. Then we're going to do a little bit of back to the schoolroom, and Scarlett's going to give you a quiz to see if you actually understood what Liz said. And then Thomas Greiber is going to talk sort of more about the compliance side of things, the bad cop approach. And then Dirk Neumann is going to talk about another sort of bad cop aspect from the perspective of journals. And then we're going to have time to break out and talk off the record in smaller groups and perhaps even within our specific sectors. So we come from all across the life sciences disciplines and including also the administrative or institutional side of things within our institutes. And we'd like to kind of give each of those groups and sectors time to talk amongst themselves. Then we'll wrap it up, send you the link to the recording, and you can come back and watch any of this at any time in the future. So with that, let me go ahead and do a second of housekeeping. First of all, we are a big group. When Scarlett and Liz and I first started talking about this, we thought we might have 50, 60 people. Well, we had over 250 registrations. That shows us that people are really interested to know, and they're also really interested to know the beginning, right? The real kind of basics about the Nagoya Protocol. But as such, as Scarlett mentioned in the very beginning, your video is going to be off your camera just to make sure that things stay stable, and also it's easier to keep focused. We'd love if you could ask questions mainly through the chat at first and to be as concise as possible so it's easy for us to follow it. And then the presentations will be recorded, but the breakout groups will not be recorded. And again, that's sort of an off the record, smaller space for you to ask any questions that are still not clear. And I really encourage you, and it is amazing how challenging all of this can be, especially when you're learning it from the very beginning. So there is no such thing as a stupid question. And then these smaller breakout rooms, please feel free to ask anything that you might not have been as comfortable to ask for on the record or with a larger group. So, and again, just because we want to have that sense of discussion, then during the breakout sessions, it'd be great to have your cameras back on. All right, so I'm going to set the stage for you. Why newbies? Why now? Right? The Nagoya Protocol actually was negotiated a decade ago and came into force in 2014, right? Coming up on 7 years. And so you might say, well, do we still need a newbies workshop, a beginner's workshop? But the reality of science, of course, is that things are constantly turning over. You always have new people arising to the scene. And in the beginning of any new implementation regime, there's always a great deal of uncertainty. In fact, even the EU Commission itself released a really important guidance document just in December, right at the end of last year, showing us that things are always kind of evolving and that we have new and better clarity on how to be compliant with the Nagoya Protocol. So what we realized in the work that Scarlett and I do within the European Virus Archive, and that Liz and I do with the German hub, the Nagoya Help Desk, if you will, is that we constantly got request for, could you guys just go back to the very beginning? Could you just, you're already too far down the pipe for me to understand. So we said, what we really need to do is go back all the way to the beginning and set the stage. And that's what this workshop is about. And we'd like to make it a permanent record, put it up on YouTube so that it's kind of there for anybody that in the future also says, tell me what this is all about again. So the place to actually start as a biologist is to remind you of something quite scary, actually, which is that the 6th mass extinction of species, and the only one that's caused by humans, is actually upon us. And the rate of extinction over time, particularly in the last century, is quite extraordinary. And these are scary numbers. And obviously, as anybody that cares about the planet that we live on, we have to have this as sort of the stamp upon our brains with which to understand this context. And so if we want to stop this extinction and this species loss, the habitat destruction, it becomes pretty clear if you look at the globe that plant and animal diversity is not just found in a single country. In fact, there are, by any measure of these 9 measures of biological diversity, the whole world is involved. And so if you want to stop extinction, you want to stop species loss, you actually have to come up with a global and international regime. And you have to also come up with political will. And political will is found most often through compromise. And so if we go back to 1992, right, to 30 years ago, the Earth Summit in Brazil, there were 3 legally binding agreements that were open for signature underneath the United Nations Environment Program. The one we're going to focus on today is everything that falls underneath the umbrella of the Convention on Biological Diversity. The one that gets, of course, a lot of press is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, where, you know, a decade or so ago, you heard a lot about Kyoto, and now most recently you hear about the Paris Accords. But in parallel to those climate change talks have been the CBD discussions and the Convention on to Combat Desertification Land Use. And what does the CBD actually say? Well, it has 3 simple objectives. Probably the first 2 are somewhat intuitive. The conservation of biological diversity, right? Think back to the first scary slide. Number 2, the sustainable use of its components. And number 3, the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits from the use of genetic resources. Now that third one, probably your eyes glazed over if you're not familiar with this, because it's not intuitive why this belongs to the other 2. The first time that you read this, you think, what does that actually mean? And the fundamental political compromise that is reached within the CBD is that if countries that are still developing their economies are being asked in the global context to conserve their biological diversity, we also recognize the right to use that biological diversity in a sustainable manner, and also grant and recognize sovereign rights over the biological diversity found in their borders. And that because of those sovereign rights, they now also have the right to have fair and equitable sharing from any benefits from that biological diversity. This is essentially, the idea is, if the countries are motivated to conserve their biological diversity because the chance to have the benefit sharing downstream, you create a virtuous cycle, right? I preserve my biodiversity because it has the potential to generate some kind of long-term funding in principle, or at least even ecotourism or other types of economic output from that biodiversity. So importantly, it is a near universal treaty. So all countries in the world have signed it, but one very large country, the United States, has not ratified it. And that does create, from the very beginning, some confusion because, of course, the scientific industry within the United States is quite big. And so I worry sometimes that the amount of attention, because of the impact of the Americans, has perhaps not been as broad as it could have or would have been. But that's just the lay of the land as it is. So since 1992, what's happened? Well, if you look back here in the middle of the graph and you look ahead to where we are now, extinction has gotten better, the rate, but in fact, it's not actually a positive trend or even flat yet. And so when we look around the globe, we see that in fact, in certain regions, like in the South Pacific and in Africa and South America in particular, the rate of loss is actually quite scary. And so there was a sense that the CBD needed to actually have better and more concrete goals. And so at the same time, that third goal was also felt to be quite weak. There were accusations of biopiracy. Many parties were not happy, asking where is the green gold that was supposed to emerge, and how do we handle the biopirates that are plaguing the world? And so at COP10, 20 years later, or almost 20 years later, in Nagoya, Japan, there was basically a political trade-off made, a horse trade between the Nagoya Protocol and the Aichi targets. The Aichi targets, on the one hand, trying to tackle the remaining challenges or the outstanding challenges around biological diversity loss. And at the same time, the Nagoya Protocol being negotiated in order to provide more transparency, legal certainty, and a means for the sharing of the benefits. Importantly, what you need to know before Liz takes over is that it's a very, very broad category to understand genetic resources: plants, animal, fungi, microbes, biochemical compounds, and the DNA and RNA, right? So basically everything living is underneath there. And importantly, there is no distinction between non-commercial and commercial. So with that, I would like to kick it over to Liz. Oh, sorry, I had one more slide I wanted to throw in here. This is just a little bit of a tug on your heart. This might not all make sense, what you're going to hear in the next half an hour, because it is in a complex field and it is hard to do in practice. Those of us that have been working in this field for a number of years know that the system is not perfect, but we remind you that this is in fact established law. And what we're trying to do here is to be proactive and to kind of grab us all underneath the arms and to pick us all up and put us on the same page. And fundamentally, the issues around the Nagoya Protocol are a question of scientific integrity and ethics. And so as much as the road ahead is not going to be bump free, we do encourage you to constantly orient on this sort of guiding star that you're doing your part for biodiversity when you are compliant with this international law and framework. With that, Liz, please take it over.
Perfect. Okay, so good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to see that so many people are here today, that so many people are interested in hearing about the Nagoya Protocol and what it means for them. And so my part of today's program is really to go into more of the kind of practical aspects of what it means for the day-to-day work of researchers. So I'm going to talk a bit more about this whole idea of access and benefit sharing. What does that mean? Then I'm going to go through the compliance obligations in Germany and the European Union. At the end, I'm going to say a little bit about the project that I'm working on, the German Nagoya Protocol HuB. And it's important that you pay attention because, as Amber mentioned, you'll be tested later. So Scarlett's going to take you through a quiz to make sure that you are not just checking your emails, but that you are also paying attention to me. So, ABS, what does this mean in practice? So we've heard it before. It's about biological material, of genetic resources to be specific. So, I mean, this could be any type of non-human biological material, but the Nagoya Protocol and this idea of access and benefit sharing also applies to the associated traditional knowledge. That's important not to forget. So we need to think about ABS when our material comes from a country that has the right to exert its sovereign right. So it's kind of a fancy way of saying that they have the right to make laws within this particular area or jurisdiction. So the laws that we want to think about are access and benefit sharing laws. So for you as a researcher, it's interesting to know about the convention. It's interesting to know about the Nagoya Protocol, which we kind of think of as being the child of the convention because it goes and takes the ABS concept and makes it a lot more concrete and detailed. But actually for you as a researcher, it's always the laws in the countries which are relevant because these are what affect you. Yeah, so in the case of, for example, German researchers, it's for law outside of Germany and when it comes to compliance about EU and German law, just as an example. So what is access and benefit sharing about? So we can break it down to like just very simple ideas. So access, we need to think about when we want to use these resources, these generic resources, this material, we need to get access. So we need to ask for permission first. So we ask the provider if we can use it for this purpose. And benefit sharing, this is what the BS stands for. It can stand for other things, but in this case, it's for benefit sharing. It's about promising to give something back to the provider of that material. So this is based on usually a contract. As Amber mentioned, it should really contribute to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and it can be many things. So I often hear people say, oh, but I'm an academic researcher, I do non-commercial basic research, I can't share money, benefit sharing, this has nothing to do with me. But actually benefit sharing does apply to basic and non-commercial research, as Amber mentioned, and benefit sharing can be a lot of things. And these benefits often flow from the research process itself and from the research output. So it could be something like collaboration, joint research, joint publication, it could be training, it could be in-kind support for research. and local researchers in the country where the material comes from. So benefit sharing can really be a lot of things, and there are a lot of benefits that can be shared by the academic research community. And very often these things flow from that normal scientific collaboration anyway, so it's not really something extra in that sense. So what do we need to do? So for this presentation, we're going to go through an infographic, which was developed through our project. It's kind of like a decision tree. It goes step by step, and it should help us to decide, okay, are we affected by ABS and are we affected by the compliance obligations of the EU? So you can find this on the website under ABS World, but we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail now. So the first step in this whole process, we need to know where the material originally comes from. So we're not interested in countries which act as intermediaries. We're interested in where this material originally came from. So we need to check whether or not that country has access and benefit sharing laws. Now, it may not, and if it does not, then access and benefit sharing is not relevant for us. And this is the case even if a country is a Nagoya Protocol country. So again, Germany is a good example of this. It's a Nagoya Protocol country, but has chosen not to require you to get permission to use the material. So if you get a soil organism that was sampled somewhere in Germany, you're free to use this for research purposes without having to share benefits, for example. So, but of course, you would still need to comply with other laws in Germany, like nature protection laws, for example, but you can kind of leave the ABS world. ABS is not relevant for you. If there are ABS laws, then the second step would be to check whether or not these laws affect you. So just because there's an access and benefit sharing law, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's relevant. So for example, it might not apply to the material that you're using. It might not apply because of what you're doing with that material. It may not apply because of when you got that material or where you got that material. So it's always important to check, okay, what are the actual requirements in this country? And again, if those ABS laws don't apply to you, then you can leave the ABS world and there's nothing further for you to worry about. But if it does affect you, then you'll need to follow the process. So you might be asking yourself, okay, when do I check this? Is it just when I go into the field and collect material, or do I have to check all the time? And basically these days, if you're doing research in the European Union, you should always check. You should check when this material came, where this material came from, and whether access and benefit sharing apply. So this includes if someone gives you the material, for example, a collaboration partner, if you buy this material from a shop, if you get it from a collection or a museum, and even if you just find this material at the back of the fridge in your laboratory. So there's some important things that you need to keep in mind. So when we're talking about access and benefit sharing, we know that this principle came from the Convention on Biological Diversity way back in 1993 when it came into force. So that means that actually access and benefit sharing has been around for a long time. So some access and benefit sharing laws actually existed before the Nagoya Protocol came into force. So there's some examples like Kenya and India that had ABS laws for a long time. Also, there are non-Nagoya Protocol countries that have access and benefit sharing laws. So we have Costa Rica, for example, Australia, Brazil, although Brazil is about to become a party to the Nagoya Protocol. So just because it's not a Nagoya Protocol country doesn't mean that ABS doesn't apply. In some countries, the laws apply not when you get the material originally, but when you start to use it. And also, I said that Germany does not have ABS laws, but there are actually EU countries that do have access laws and require benefit sharing. So it's important to check, even if that material is coming from within the EU. So the next question is like, okay, how do I even check? Where do I get information about access and benefit sharing? I have no idea where to start. Well, the first step is always the Access and Benefit Sharing Clearinghouse. This is an international online information portal where every country has its own profile. And at least in theory, this is where you can get all the information about ABS. You have to be a little bit cautious with this ABS clearinghouse. So I have an example here. It's Vietnam. So at the top, you have the party status and when this country became a party. So this is the information that you can always rely on. This is always correct. And everything else is hopefully correct, but may not be. So we need to be a little bit cautious. But there's a lot of useful information here There are contact details for the national focal point, the competent national authority, which is the authority that should issue the permit to you if you need one. And it also tells you about whether or not access and benefit sharing laws exist. And in this case, they do. So in the second step, you would have a look and you would try to find out whether or not these might actually apply to you. And even if you're doing non-commercial research, for example, it's possible that these laws apply and that you would need to see or look for more information. So Vietnam's a good example. They have all of the information there. You can download the law. It's even available in English. There's a formal translation, and I can see, okay, I need a permit or a license in Vietnam if I'm using these genetic resources for any purpose. So yes, ABS applies to me. What happens if there's information missing? And this is possible. Sometimes there's just no information in the ABS clearinghouse about ABS in a particular country. And maybe you heard on the grapevine, there are ABS laws, but they're just not listed in the clearinghouse. What can you do? Where can you find more information? So there are lots of options. What a lot of people do and start with is to contact the national focal point. So this is the person listed right at the top of the profile. This person should be able to point you in the right direction, even if they're not actually responsible for providing you with the permit, for example. Unfortunately, they don't always respond or may respond very slowly. If that's the case, you could try contacting the competent national authority directly. Again, if there's no information or no one's responding, you could also try the national focal point of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This person may be able to point you in the right direction. Of course, you can always have a look at national government websites. They have information, for example, about ABS in their country. This is not always going to be available in English or perhaps in another language that you're able to speak. So this is where your collaboration partners can be really important. So your collaboration partners who are in the country where the material comes from, because this is their country, their language, and they can make inquiries for you, and they probably have ways of getting information that you as a researcher in Europe probably don't have. So collaboration partners can be really, really critical in this whole process. You can ask around, you can try to find people who've worked there before, you can search the internet. There are lots of resources out there. There are fact sheets, there are academic papers, there are information documents about ABS. I have a couple of examples here. You can also try reaching out to the competent authority in your own country. So for example, in Germany, this is the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation. They also have a lot of information about ABS in different countries. They may be able to help you. And of course, you can also have a look on the German Nagoya Protocol Hub website or contact us. We may be able to help as well. So if there's a lot of information, it's really important to read it. So for example, if you want to work in Vietnam, there are no excuses. There's a national website in English, there are fact sheets, there's information documents, and the government of Vietnam even prepared a guidance document for researchers so they can find out what to do. It's very important to read the information. Not reading the information and not understanding what you need to do can really slow down the process. Yeah, so it's important to read it. I understand that sometimes it's a little bit complicated, but I've seen this happen, people needing much, much longer to get their permit than they probably should have because they just didn't read the information properly. So you have all the information, and now it's time to follow the ABS process. So it might look complicated, but actually it may be more simple than it initially appears. You never know, it always depends on the country. The thing is that access and benefit sharing is different everywhere. So this is one of the frustrations that people have because it's not just one standard process, it's different wherever you go. But the good news is that sometimes there are simplified procedures for non-commercial researchers. So for example, you just have to notify the government that you're doing your research, or you have to register, for example. Perhaps you just need a permit, but as a non-commercial researcher in some countries, you may also need both a permit and a contract. So also a benefit sharing agreement in addition to the permit. It always depends. And this is why it's so important for you to inform yourself. But it's important not to panic because maybe it's not as bad as it seems. And really, there are a lot of examples out there of access and benefit sharing working. So here's one example from Vietnam. The researcher only needed 4 months to get the permit. The biggest lesson learned that we have from all of these ABS cases is that people need to start really early. So it's very, very important to start early with the whole ABS process. So if your research project has already started and you haven't even thought about ABS yet, then it's probably a little too late, but you should start immediately. Actually, ideally, you should start well before your research project begins with thinking about ABS, informing yourself, finding out what you need to do, and kicking off the process. We also find that it's very useful to be clear and transparent in your communication with the authorities. Help them to understand your research, what you're doing, and what benefits you can potentially share with them. I mentioned this before, that support from a local collaboration partner may be very helpful, but in some cases, it's absolutely essential. Sometimes, the person needs to go into the authorities in person, sign documents, etc., etc. Multiple visits may be necessary. And from Germany or from Europe, this is just not possible to organize. Especially now with Corona and the travel restrictions, it's extremely difficult. So if you don't have a local collaboration partner, but there is a possibility to take one on board, then that might help. It might get the ABS process moving forward much more quickly. Another tip is to always check your documents for accuracy and completeness, including all of the supporting documentation and any translations. Again, this can really slow down the process if they're not correct. And also you need to follow up regularly. So you need to follow up with your partners, you need to follow up with the authorities, and you really need to be active about keeping the process moving forward. So you need an ABS permit. What things do you need to keep in mind? As I said, it's important to be transparent with the authorities. So this would also include being transparent about who is involved in the research and asking how to proceed. So the important thing for you as a researcher in Europe is to make sure that everyone who receives and uses the material for research is permitted to do so. There's no point getting a permit which has been issued to one particular institution. You need to share it with another institution, and this is not permitted. And the other thing that you really need to do is check that you can do everything that you need to do with the permit that you've received. So if you need to export the material from the country, you want to sequence it, you want to publish the data, etc., etc., etc. These are all really important things that need to be taken into account, and you need to check that the permit covers these things. So you might get a permit that looks like this. This is a national permit. It's just an example that I found on the clearinghouse. Something like this is completely sufficient. You might get something like this. This is called an internationally recognized certificate of compliance. This is not a national permit. This is something that's generated. The certificate is generated through the ABS clearinghouse. The authority in the provider country enters the information into the clearinghouse, and it generates this certificate. This is also good. So you can have a national permit or you can have one of these certificates, but if you're doing research in Europe, you need to have one or the other. I often get asked, but I have a collection permit, an export permit, a CITES permit, etc., etc., etc. Do I really need another one? And the answer is well, it always depends. It always depends on the country. It depends on their requirements. If they say, okay, ABS is covered by our collection permit, then you're okay. But very often the ABS permit is actually something separate, And the question you always need to ask yourself is, do I have legal access to the genetic resource? So can I use the genetic resource for research, And if you're not sure, then you need to ask the authorities in the country. You have to ask them and clarify whether or not your permit covers what you need to do, and you need legal access to the genetic resource. So that's the bottom line. What about the contract? So not everyone has written a contract before. If you need a benefit sharing agreement, it is a contract. You need to keep this in mind. So there are a few things to think about. So you need to check, first of all, who can negotiate and sign this contract. So it may not be you. It might actually be someone else from your institution who's responsible for these things. You really need to know where you can get support from within your institution and who needs to be involved. So you may actually need to touch base, for example, with your legal department before anything is signed. The good news is that you don't have to write everything from scratch. Very often there are model agreements which are used or can be used as a basis for the negotiation and for the agreement. So I have an example here on the left side. This is from Vietnam. This is their standard agreement, which they use. So the country itself may have a standard agreement, which is used and then just modified for each case. There are also examples of model clauses which have been produced, for example, by the German Research Foundation or the Swiss Academy for Science. So these organizations have developed model clauses. The nice thing about these is even if you don't use them, they have little short explanations which kind of explain the purpose of the different clauses and what you're trying to do. So these are useful resources as well. So, caution. What have I noticed? I've had a lot of inquiries since the project started. I've noticed that people often don't read their ABS documentation. There are a lot of assumptions that get made about the documentation, what's covered, etc., etc. So it's really, really important that you keep in mind that you need to check things like the expiry date, if there are any conditions of use, if there are any restrictions on the transfer of the material, if you have reporting obligations. I had a recent case, I saw a permit, for example, someone did a good job, they got organized, they organized their permit well in advance of their collecting trip, but actually the permit looked like it had expired before the collecting trip had even taken place. So it's very important to read the documentation, to read the conditions and make sure that you know what you need to do. So if everyone's sort of feeling like, oh, this is a lot, it is a lot, it is complicated, but there are also tools out there to try and help. So through the project, we developed this strategy. It's basically just a checklist, but it's intended to help you to keep all of those things in mind that you need to take into account. So for example, before the process started, what things you need to have in your research project to make it possible, the kinds of benefits that you can share, and also taking into account possible future research. So this checklist is designed to help you prepare and get ready for the ABS process. So you can also find this on the Nagoya Protocol HuB website. So once you've fulfilled all of the requirements in the country where the material comes from, you can start your research. So I say here, now entering the EU, actually, as I said before, ABS laws also exist in the EU. So we might already be in the EU, but the point is now that we want to talk all about compliance. So the important thing to keep in mind, let's step back and have a look at the whole infographic. Here is not where our journey starts, yeah? We can see here that we've already come a long way. And some people think, oh, I'm in the EU, so the only thing that's relevant for me is the EU law on compliance, but that's not the case, yeah? We can see this. The good news is that if we've got this far, we're already a long way towards complying with our obligations in the EU. So this is the good news. So let's have a look at these compliance obligations a little closer. What does it mean in practice? So you need to know that there's this EU regulation, it's number 511 of 2014. And this is really about creating transparency in research and development. And it creates these things called due diligence obligations. So these also apply for basic and non-commercial researchers potentially. If you fall within the scope of the regulation, we'll look at this in a moment. So what's this whole idea of due diligence? What's this about? So it's really about being thorough, systematic, and giving your best effort to get information about ABS and to get the ABS documentation that you need for your material and your research. So it's not just about being aware of rules, but complying with them and possibly having to do things in a different way and adapt if necessary. And the whole purpose is basically to stop research that's not Nagoya Protocol conformed. So what we mean here is not confirmed with ABS laws in Nagoya Protocol countries from taking place in the European Union. So Amber mentioned this before. I'm going to mention it again because this is really, really important. This document is very helpful. So the new guidance document came out in December. It has lots of information about the scope of the regulation, your obligations, and understanding whether or not your material or research is covered by the regulation or not. So the link should be in the chat. You should download this, you should read it. It's available in all EU languages. Yeah, you don't need to read everything. So not everyone might be that interested in ABS that they feel like they need to read all 150 pages, but you can search the document and you can find those parts which are relevant and interesting for you. So we have to think about our obligations in the EU as being additional, additional to the obligations, the ABS obligations that we have in the country where the material came from. So a few different questions that we have to ask ourselves. We have to ask ourselves where the material came from and whether that was a Nagoya Protocol country, if the material was obtained originally before or after the 12th of October 2014. This is kind of the key cutoff date, if you will, which is when the Nagoya Protocol came into force. And then we have this question about like the type of material and the type of research we're doing. And all of these are important. We have to say yes to all of these questions to be within the scope of the EU regulation. Now, the thing is, if we're not, we still have to comply with our ABS permit and our benefit sharing obligations. But the good news is there's nothing further for us to do in the EU. So let's look at these two questions here about the material and the research, because these are the ones that are usually the most difficult to understand and to work out whether or not we're in scope or not. So material. So we referred to genetic resources before. Again, it could be more or less any type of material, biological material, which is not human. It has actual potential value. And as Amber mentioned right at the beginning, it contains genes, but it's not just about DNA. So in the EU, research on biochemical compounds, so in Nagoya Protocol speak, these are referred to as derivatives. These can be things like proteins or lipids. These are also covered by the EU regulations. So that means you need ABS documentation. If there is sufficient continuity between this biochemical compound, so it's derivative, and the material itself. What isn't covered, okay, it's been mentioned a few times. This is the human DNA, for example. There are also examples of resources out there which are covered by other international agreements. So the International Plant Treaty or the PIP framework, which deals with pandemic influenza viruses. These are not covered by the EU regulation, unless, of course, the material comes from a country which is not part of those instruments, or the material is being used for a purpose which is not covered by those instruments. So there is an exception to the exception, which you might need to keep in mind. There's also other types of material which is not covered. So one example is laboratory strains, and these examples are covered in this guidance document that was referred to before. The important thing is, don't forget, and this often does get forgotten, that the regulation, of course, also applies to associated traditional knowledge. So knowledge associated with these genetic resources. What type of research is covered? This is utilization. That's the fancy word for this. This just refers to research and development, which also includes non-commercial basic research, which investigates the biochemical and or genetic composition of the material, and it creates new knowledge about this material. There are some exceptions. Again, these are discussed in detail in the EU guidance documents, but it always depends on the circumstances. So it's not so easy to say one thing is in or out. There are a lot of gray areas, if, buts, and whens. One example is taxonomy. It's not usually regarded as utilization, as long as there's no investigation of the genes, the gene function, etc., etc. If taxonomy is just involving, for example, the identification and classification of organisms. So what does this mean? So it might be that the ABS laws of a provided country cover the material, cover the research, you need an ABS permit from that country, but you don't have any due diligence obligations in the EU. Now, so we have to kind of keep that in mind. You might have ABS obligations, but potentially no due diligence obligations because of the type of research you do. So if you are in scope, there are just a few last things you need to do. We're almost finished, we're almost there. So you need to check whether or not you need to submit a due diligence declaration. So this needs to be done if your research is third-party funded. So if you're working with core funding of your research institute, there's no need for you to submit a due diligence declaration. This declaration has to be done after you have all of the material and before your research ends, or before the financing period of your research ends. And the purpose of this due diligence declaration is to notify the competent authority in your country that A, your research and material of Nagoya Protocol relevant, and B, that you've complied with your ABS obligations. It's easy. Some people are like, oh God, the due diligence declaration, what do I do, etc., etc. It's really quite straightforward. It's probably one of the quickest and easiest things that you'll do in this whole process. If you have the information, your permit number, etc., etc., it probably takes 10 to 15 minutes to do this. You log into this platform. It's called Declare. It's hosted by the EU Commission. And then you just put the information in there. Your institution may have a centralized account. So you need an account in order to log in. If your university or your research institute has an account, then you should contact the administrator at your institution and ask them to give you access to this so that you can do your declaration. Okay, so I have to ask myself, okay, I need to do a declaration and I'm getting the material from someone else. So what questions should I ask myself? So it's really important, if you're not directly collecting material, but maybe you're getting it from someone else, you have to ask this person to give you all of the ABS documentation, because you're going to need this in order to do your declaration and also to comply with your access and benefit sharing obligations. So researchers typically transfer material on the basis of a material transfer agreement, but that itself will not be enough. Yeah, this is not enough in order for you to do your declaration. You need to have the accompanying ABS documentation as well. So if someone's giving you the material, ask them to give you a copy of the material. So, and you're probably asking yourself, okay, I need the ABS documentation. I don't have any. So what happens then? Unfortunately, without having the ABS documentation, you can't do your research. So basically, no utilization until such time as you get the document. The good thing about the EU regulation is it provides you the flexibility to go back and get the documents if you can. So last few steps: comply with the obligations in your ABS documentation, keep the documentation for 20 years after your research ends. So the good news is you don't have to keep the samples, you just have to keep the documentation. If you transfer the documentation to someone else who's going to do research with it as well, you need to provide these people with the documentation. And finally, you need to support user checks by the competent authority. So I'm not going to say too much about that, because you're going to hear another presentation about that in a moment from Thomas Greiber, who may or may not put the fear of God on you, but hopefully not. So what are our take-home messages? I'm almost done. So take-home messages. So let's look at our infographic yet again, but like from our global perspective. So yeah, this is the ABS world, and it's really made up of two parts, yeah? And as a researcher, you need to think about and you need to understand both. You need to understand what you need to do to fulfill access and benefit sharing obligations, but you also need to understand how to fulfill your compliance obligations in the EU if they apply to you. It's complicated. That's well understood. There's a lot of sympathy for researchers who have to go through this process. It's not always easy. We acknowledge that, but it's really important to do your homework, to find the information and to read the information that's available. And it's complicated, but you can manage it by just breaking it down into steps, going step by step, and knowing which steps you need to take. You also need to know where to look for information and help if you need it. This could be challenging, but as we said, there are ways forward. For example, contacting your collaboration partners in the provider country. And we'll hear more about this when we hear the compliance checks talk. But yeah, this is serious. It's the law, and there are consequences for not following ABS laws and the EU regulation as well. So just very, very briefly, there is help out there. The German Nagoya Protocol Hub is there to support the academic research community. This is a joint project from the DSMZ where I work. Our partners, the Consortium of German Natural Sciences Collections, the Leibniz Research Alliance for Biodiversity, and the German Life Sciences Association. This is a German-funded or German government-funded project, and we're trying to help the academic community. So we provide information. We've built up this website. We're producing tools. We're putting information there that's already existing and trying to make it easy to find and accessible and explain it to the academic community to make ABS and also due diligence easier for them. If you still have questions, you can't find what you're looking for, you are of course welcome to reach out and ask questions. You can do this through the contact form. We're also doing networking events for German institutions. We set up a network. We come together every few months to talk about compliance and also access and benefit sharing, the challenges and how to deal with them. And we do outreach and awareness raising like we're doing today, but also for individual institutions. You can keep in touch. You can follow us on Twitter. You can subscribe to our mailing list. Please do so. We'll keep you informed about upcoming events, and we're very active on Twitter, so we can let you know about what's happening in the ABS world. So thank you for your attention.
So with that, Thomas Greiber is the competent national authority for Germany. It sits at the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, and he wants to kind of give you a little bit of the Nagoya cop perspective, if we can playfully say that. So Thomas, take it away.
Thank you very much. I will talk a little bit about compliance checks under the EU regulation as we do them in Germany. Just to say that colleagues in other EU member states take different approaches. We all apply the same EU regulation, but it gives some discretion to national authorities how they approach it, and you will also see soon the reason why this is the case. So the situation in Germany is that, as colleagues said before, I'm working at the Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, the BFN, which is the competent authority in charge of implementing the EU regulation in Germany. We are under the Ministry of Environment, which is still the national focal point. And as the national focal point, the ministry is in charge of the further negotiations and reportings under the Nagoya Protocol. So our job at the agency is looking at the EU regulation, doing compliance checks, but also providing advice. We have a number of partners with whom we collaborate when implementing the EU regulation. We have two cooperation agencies. One is the Federal Office for Agriculture and Food when it comes to genetic resources for food and agriculture. Then we have the Robert Koch Institute, with whom we cooperate when it comes to human pathogens. And then the German Patent Office is also informing us about patent applications that involve genetic resources as it is foreseen under the German patent law. And we at the BFN, we receive due diligence declarations that you heard before. We receive applications from collections that want to become members of the EU register of collections. We undertake compliance checks if we find non-compliance situations, so violations of the due diligence obligations. We also have the right to apply sanctions, but we are also trying to inform our German users and provide advice through the Nagoya Protocol Hub, but also directly. When we do our compliance checks, we try to collect and analyze information from different sources, which might provide us guidance on who in Germany is actually doing research utilization under the EU regulation. The due diligence declarations that we receive, they tell us about utilization taking place in Germany. We are looking at scientific publications and what researchers have published there with foreign material. As I said before, the German Patent Office provides us with information on a regular basis about patent applications. We do or have done user surveys We get also further information from previous compliance checks that we undertook, so they might lead us to other users. And of course, we are analyzing or searching the websites, the internet annual reports, provide us some information on who's doing research. Patent databases is another interesting source of information there. How do we do our compliance checks? The EU regulation says, first of all, obliges every EU member state to undertake such compliance checks. And the EU regulation names a few criteria. The compliance checks should be effective, proportionate, dissuasive, and detect cases of non-compliance. And the compliance checks are triggered in two different ways. Either if we have substantiated concerns, let's say we came across information that research has been undertaken with Nagoya Protocol material or relevant material from a Nagoya Protocol party, then we can start a compliance check. In addition, we have to develop compliance plans, control plans on a periodic basis, which should be risk-based. That is what the EU regulation also says. So we have to identify risks in view of non-compliance with the EU regulation, put them in a plan, and based on such a plan, we then start our compliance checks. And so far, we've done this in a stepwise approach in Germany. We started in a written manner. So we identified institutions that we will check. We sent a questionnaire to these institutions, went through a process. We then could do on-the-spot checks if necessary. If we find non-compliance situations, we try to enforce compliance and order remedial actions. And of course, as I said, as an ultima ratio, we also have regulatory fines as sanctions. The process of the compliance checks, as I said, we start in a written manner with a questionnaire. In a first round, we ask general questions to check whether there is awareness about Nagoya and the EU regulation. We ask about due diligence measures that have been taken in the institution, responsibilities, who's responsible in a specific institution for Nagoya Protocol issues. We also ask, of course, whether material from third countries have been utilized, and if due diligence declarations have been filed or products have been developed. So in this first step, we try to clarify whether the institution and the researchers working there are within the scope of the EU regulation. And as I said at the beginning, we are also trying to check awareness in order to see is there further need for awareness raising, for capacity building in our institutions. Then in a second step, we try to clarify open questions if there are any. So we sometimes need to confirm that we have the same understanding of terminology, especially when it comes to utilization, which is the term used by the Nagoya Protocol and the EU regulation. We heard not all kinds of research are utilization. So we are asking questions based also on the information that we previously collected, and sometimes also challenge if institutions basically reply, no, we are not doing utilization, but we have, for example, a paper which says a publication, we've seen a publication that tells us something different, then we will challenge this response. And again, the objective is to clarify whether there is compliance and whether the institution falls under the EU regulation. In a third round, so to say, we can then undertake on-the-spot checks, meaning showing up at the institutions, interviewing staff, asking for copies of documents. We can even take samples, and all again to see if the institution and their research is within scope of the EU regulation and if they have complied with Nagoya Protocol obligations. In case of non-compliance, and we have detected already a few cases where institutions did not comply with the EU regulation, we first order to remedy the breaches. That means concretely, we first prohibit the further utilization of the material, so research has to stop. And also a publication of the research material is prohibited. We then request the institution to apply for the documents, the Nagoya or the ABS documents retroactively. And if they are not willing, or if it's not possible, then we will prohibit the utilization definitively. And this again includes the prohibition to publish research results, and we will also see if we can retract publications. Last but not least, we will seize and confiscate the genetic material. We will also notify the country of origin where the material was taken from without fulfilling the ABS obligations under the country's law. And we will sanction. As I mentioned, we have regulatory fines which go up to 50,000 euros. For some, this is a lot of money. For others, maybe not so threatening, but just to mention also that other EU member states have fines that go far beyond the 50,000 euros. We have EU member states that foresee fines up to 2 million euros and even criminal sanctions. And even in Germany, if you are undertaking commercial research and you're developing a product and you bring that on the market, we may also basically take away the, go beyond the 50,000 and take away the financial benefit that was developed. Other possible consequences in case of non-compliance, which are not foreseen in the EU regulation but still exist, those go from reputational damage to prison. Bad publicity is, of course, not wanted and a possible threat. You don't want to be accused as a of being a biopirate. There are countries who are planning to do blacklisting of researchers and institutions that have not complied with their ABS laws. Collections often reject the deposition of material that was obtained without the proper ABS documents. Grants from foundations can be reclaimed. As I said before, some countries even foresee criminal sanctions. Imprisonment in some countries goes up to 6 years, which is a long time, and patent claims can be rejected. So that's all from my side, and I think Dirk will follow up on some of the, let's say, reputational challenges and documentation.
Yeah, just to continue what Thomas just stopped, maybe a little bit of background. My name is Dirk Neumann. I'm based at the Bavarian Natural History Collections in Munich, and I have been involved with ABS since 2011 probably, and currently functioning as co-chair for the ABS working groups of DNFS and also for CTAF, that's the European Natural History Collections. Now I see, yeah. So the main point that might be worth considering is if you publish, you increase visibility. And as Thomas pointed out, visibility may not always include your key audience, which is the researcher, but for example, also the providing states which check if your research was done legally compliant. And journals increasingly start to ask researchers for affirmative statements regarding ABS compliance. So we have seen this in other areas, if you do animal experience, for example, but that is increasingly seen also towards compliance with existing national ABS laws and access to genetic resources. And some journals like molecular ecology already make that as a condition for publication. So you need to answer these questions to be able to publish your research results. And some journals also start to require a note on benefit sharing. So that means that you have shared the benefits that results from your research. Thomas pointed out already that there have been cases of retraction of articles. I give you here one example that was a paper with researchers from the Philippines that collected material in Malaysia and sequenced that in the field. So they did DNA barcoding in the field in Malaysia without sufficient permits. And the Sabah Biodiversity Center informed the publisher that the relevant permits were not there, and the journal and the publisher retracted the article. So that is, I think, one of the most recent cases where a paper has been retracted. And of course, that also creates some sort of visibility. Not all researchers or institutions the researchers are affiliated with would like to see. And that can be especially damaging if that is a highly reputed institution. I think the prime example that is available online is Oxford. Oxford had very early ABS procedures in place to support research staff with ABS compliance. However, there were amateur researchers that deposited material in the collection. So that was a fancy blue tarantula that was described. And even though that description did not include any sequencing, the case, because the name of Oxford is so iconic, was used and covered in a science article as a potential example of non-compliance, which in the end led to the situation that Oxford has to publicly distance itself from that two researchers in a statement that is still available online. So naming these people, these researchers by name, and clearly stating that those researchers do not belong to Oxford University. And I think that is a huge reputational damage, not only for the researchers, so their scientific career surely will be difficult in future, but as we heard earlier this year from colleagues in the UK, the University of Oxford is suffering still a lot from that reputational damage. And even though the researchers, the scientists were not even staff of that institution. So that really researchers, I think, really need to understand that they have a responsibility that goes beyond their own research interests and beyond their own research project. So, and I want to leave it here. I think we will have more on that maybe in the breakout groups.